Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. It is 11 after 9 o'clock, and now we are going to be looking at the Rand, the performance of the Rand. It has continued to chip away at the dollar in recent sessions, with market concerns about the US Federal Reserve will slow the pace of its interest rate hikes, putting pressure on the greenback. So, what does that mean for the South African Rand? Does that mean it is getting slightly stronger? Is it a good sign? Is it good for us as South Africans? Or does that bode ill for people who import goods from around the world? Let's talk with a regular on the show, and that is Economist DawieRoodt. A very good morning. Welcome to the program, Darby. Nice to be talking with you again.
Good morning to you.
Okay, is this something to be excited about, or is it really the rand strengthening very marginally? Does it not do much for us as South Africans?
In fact, things change all the time, and that story is a little bit old because the past 24 hours things changed again. So
Oh,
let's just try to let's just try to understand what the underlying trends are that's currently happening, so that we know what is going on at the moment. So what we have at the moment is that, remember, the US dollar is by far the most important currency in the world. It's the world's most important reserve currency, and everything centers around the US dollar. So when the dollar goes up, for example, everything else goes down usually, and vice versa. So whatever whatever is happening to the US dollar is important to all of us. If the dollar appreciates, for example, then the rand usually falls in value. At the moment, what we're experiencing globally is that there are very high levels of inflation and a slowdown in economic growth globally. The same in South Africa. We have inflation that is rising, and we have, with that, the South African Reserve Bank increasing interest rates, and they will continue to do that. But exactly the same sort of situation is happening in the United States. They also have inflation. In fact, the inflation at the moment is higher than what we have in South Africa, and they started increasing interest rates in the United States as well. Now, when you increase interest rates, what usually happens is that you make your currency more attractive, and that usually supports your currency. So what we have been seeing in America the last couple of months, they have started increasing interest rates, and in the process, the US dollar has been strengthening, and the rand, amongst others, have been falling in value. But it's not a static thing. It keeps on changing every day, and for the past 24 hours, for example, some of the senior people at the central bank in America indicated that they will continue to increase interest rates in the United States, and that simply means that the US dollar is likely to remain relatively strong. And in fact, the past 24 hours, the US dollar actually went up again against most other currencies, including against the South African currency. And today, as of this morning, the rand is about 20 cents or so weaker against the US dollar than compared to yesterday. So it's a seesaw thing. It's up and down. I think the underlying trend at the moment certainly is for the dollar to keep on appreciating against most other things. But when it comes to the South African currency, the rand, there are some other side shows that are important as well. There are two things that I think are important. One is commodity prices are rather high, like the oil price and platinum prices and all that. And that is mostly good for South Africa. Of course, a high oil price is not good for South Africa, but high other commodities is usually good for South Africa because we export that stuff. So we're exporting more than what we are importing at the moment. And that means there's a net inflow of money into South Africa, and that supports the exchange rate of the currency at the moment. A second factor has to do with the South African Reserve Bank. They started increasing interest rates quite early in the cycle, which is a good thing, and that supports the South African currency, and they're likely to keep on doing that, and that will support the rand further over the next couple of months. So those are two side factors that is of particular importance to the South African currency, the rand. But underlying the big trends at the moment is a rather strong US dollar.
okay, I'm going to be asking you very diverse questions, but of course, it's tied into currencies all around the world. And I've picked up on all of this as you were speaking, and things have just popped into my mind. So I do need to ask you this. Coming out of the conference, the ANC conference this weekend, we do know one of the issues that was discussed by the ANC leadership was the nationalisation of the South African Reserve Bank. As an economist, how do you respond to that? Is it good for the country or not?
It's not going to make a difference, really. It's probably going to be more bad than good. I just want to mention that I have shares in the South African Reserve Bank. And there are reasons why I have shares in the Reserve Bank. One reason has to do with the fact that I get access to certain information, which is public information in any event. So I go there and I get a book of a lot of statistics and a lot of economic data and information, and all that. The other reason is that I get invited to go to the annual general meeting at the South African Reserve Bank, and they give you a very nice biltong there. So those are the two reasons why I'm shares in it. It's not because of the money that I'm making out of my investment,
I
because
was about to say that you're one of that 10% of the South African population who've invested in the South African
no,
Reserve Bank and enjoy good interest, a good
no,
return on investment.
that is not the case. In fact, if I remember correctly, my last dividend check was something like 8 rand.
Oh, okay.
So no, that's
Or
no, certainly this is not a good investment. So that's not the reason why I'm invested. I'm invested for other reasons. So the South African Reserve Bank, maybe just a step back in history, money was mostly under control of the private sector. And today we have some examples of that as well. Like, for example, Bitcoin is a good example of money that is being issued by the private sector. But that used to be the case in most of our history, is that money was actually under control of the private sector. It's only relatively recently that government started taking over or trying to take complete over the issuing of money. They've always tried to do that in the past, and in all cases, without exception, governments or politicians have destroyed money when they've taken over money. There are many, many examples of that. And in case, even in today's modern economies, if you look at the South African currency, the rand, which is basically been under control of the South African Central Bank, which is basically under control of government. I'll come back to that just now. The rand has lost something like 99% of its value since its inception. So, what do we have in the South African Reserve Bank? It's a bit of a historical quirk, but it still basically belongs to a private sector. I'm a shareholder there. But the governor of the South African Reserve Bank and all the deputy governors and half of the board of directors are appointed by the state president. So me, as a shareholder in the South African Reserve Bank, I have absolutely no say over monetary policy, that's interest rates and stuff like that. But I have got a vote on the appointment of half of the directors of the South African Reserve Bank. But it's not, I've got no say over things like, for example, monetary interest rates and stuff like that. And I think it's a good combination because as a private sector shareholder, I've got some oversight on certain things happening at the Reserve Bank. I have a bit of a vote, but it doesn't really mean much. So if you want to change that, if you want to take my shareholding away and the state nationalize my shareholding, what's going to change? Nothing is going to change because the president will continue to appoint the governor at the Reserve Bank. They are still independent because that's what the constitution says. They can make decisions on interest rates and stuff like that. And I have no say over that. And if I lose my shareholding, I still won't have any say over that. But
okay.
the message that we're going to
Mhm.
send is that government wants to get closer to the Reserve Bank, and that's a bad message because
Right,
politicians
exactly.
always misuse that position.
Absolutely. And of course, we know we are still battling the whole state capture saga and just how it's
Exactly.
brought us to our knees here in South Africa. Okay, that we'll reserve for another conversation, another time, and we'll go dig much deeper into that. Let's look at the greenback again, the US dollar. Let's look at the situation in Russia and Ukraine. uh, Obviously, with this war situation, with Ukraine being on its knees, Russia's brought it to its knees. We know how it's impacted on the major world economies all around the world. Does that mean then that the Russian ruble is that much stronger because of this war? And I know Putin was talking at some point in not dealing in dollars and greenback any longer, that he wants the Russian ruble to gain in strength and be a currency to be reckoned with.
Yeah. All right. But first, let me just make a comment about the US currency, the dollar, the greenback. The US dollar is the most dominant currency in the world. It's the most important reserve currency and will remain to be that for quite a long period of time. And there are many reasons for that. But a very important reason has to do with the US capital market. Let me explain what I mean with that. If we in South Africa, if we export platinum, for example, then the South African Reserve Bank will eventually end up with the dollars that we earn internationally by exporting platinum. So the South African Reserve Bank, Lesetja Kganyago, the governor, doesn't take these dollars and put it under his bed. He takes these dollars and reinvest it back in the US, in the United States, and he will invest it back in the US capital market. That's mostly US government debt instruments. Now, the same happens when we get a surplus of euros, for example. So you will take the euros and reinvest it back in the European capital markets. But in the case of Europe, it's quite a fragmented capital market because you can invest in German bunds or in Italian bonds or in Greek bonds. It's a fragmented capital market, unlike in the United States, where they have a single capital market which is very, very big and very liquid. And the most traded instrument in the world is, in fact, US government bonds. They're called TBs or treasury bills. The same goes if you have a surplus of renminbis, that is the Chinese currency, you can reinvest it back in China, but there are all sort of capital controls. So you can't just invest in China, you have to get permission from the Chinese central bank and all that. So it's very difficult to have to invest your renminbis back in China. So the obvious place or the obvious currency to use will be the US dollar because of the capital market behind the US dollar. Now, in the case of what happened with the ruble, that's a Russian currency, of course, they also trade in dollars mostly before the war, but now there are sanctions against Russia, making it difficult for Russia to get access to the so-called SWIFT stelsel or SWIFT system. The SWIFT system is a system whereby financial institutions trade mostly in dollars internationally, but the Russians have been cut off from that, and that means that they cannot trade as easily financially internationally. And what happened soon after they've been cut off from SWIFT is that the Russian ruble collapsed because of that. But the Russian central bank is a very shrewd central bank, and I've forgotten her name, but the governor there did actually a very good job in protecting the ruble's value. Because what they've done, they've increased interest rates a lot in Russia, and like I've explained earlier, that supports your currency. The ruble was supported by that, but they also prevented capital flows, money leaving Russia, and also other measures that they put in place, like halting trade on the financial markets in Russia and all that. And the effect of that was initially the ruble took a knock, but gradually the ruble stabilized and gradually started coming back. And in fact, today, the exchange rate of the ruble is stronger than before the invasion of the Ukraine. In the meantime, the Russians and the Chinese and many other countries, probably South Africa as well, are trying to implement or establish an alternative system to SWIFT. In fact, a system already existed before the invasion of the Ukraine, and I've got a suspicion that many countries, like the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians, but maybe some other BRICS countries, will eventually start using that system as well. So that's what the Russians are currently trying to do. So the Russian ruble at the moment is actually doing quite surprisingly well, and for the reasons I've mentioned, but also because of the high international oil price and other commodity prices as well.
Where does that leave Ukraine and its economy? We know that obviously they're being invaded very aggressively by the Russians. So all form of trade has completely come to a standstill. Even agriculture, just nothing is happening in that country. Where does it leave its currency? And let's assume that the war ends tomorrow, hopefully. They're going to have to start rebuilding.
Yeah.
Where do they get the resources from? Because it's going to cost billions of dollars or rubles or whatever currency they deal in to get the country back on its feet again.
Yeah. Maybe just look at the Russian economy itself. The Russian economy is probably going to shrink or contract by between 6 and 10% this year because of sanctions. I was in Russia about 2 months ago. The Russian economy is not in free fall, but certainly they will be affected by what is happening because of the sanctions. But it's not an economy in free fall. In fact, in many instances, they're doing actually quite well, and I mentioned commodities. In the case of the Ukrainian economy, their economy is likely to contract by as much as 50%. So the Ukrainian economy is in very, very deep trouble. And it is, for many reasons, obviously the war, but the eastern part of the Ukraine is the industrial heartland of the Ukraine, and that's the part that has been taken over by Russia, while the rest of the Ukraine is mostly agricultural, and that part is kind of functioning again. They've recently started exporting wheat again from the Ukraine, but that economy has been damaged hugely, infrastructurally wise, but the normal economic activities as well. So if the war stops tomorrow, who's going to fund that? Well, in a weird kind of way, if the war stops tomorrow and they start rebuilding the Ukrainian economy, of course, it will be very good for the Ukrainian economy. But that's the way that economic activities are calculated. I think we've spoken about this previously. If the neighbor's boy breaks my window and I put in a new window, then that will be added to economic activity. But the fact that it was broken initially will not be subtracted from economic activity. So if the war stops tomorrow, and the rebuilding of the Ukraine, the infrastructure will lead to an absolute huge boost to economic activity in Ukraine. And I suspect they will get many billions of dollars in grants or donations from many countries in the world. And they can also borrow money from places like, for example, the World Bank to rebuild their economy. That's probably where the money is going to come from. What happened in Western Europe, especially in Germany after the Second World War, the Americans gave a lot of money, the so-called Marshall Plan, to Germany just after the Second World War, and that led to the German miracle economic recovery. And the same sort of thing can potentially happen in Ukraine. But for now, it's war, and I've got a suspicion that Russia will keep the Donbas area and Crimea, of course. I know the Western world call it Crimea, but the Russians call it Crimea. And I also think it's quite possible that the Russians can take over a piece of land called Transnistria, which is between Moldova and the Ukraine. If they do that, then there's only a small part of Ukraine that still give them access to the Black Sea, and a very important harbor, Odessa, is there as well. And I won't be surprised if the Russians decide to take that over as well. If they do that, then the Ukraine will become a completely landlocked country. So I'm afraid the best case scenario, I would say, for that whole war is probably a partial takeover of Russia of part of the Ukraine and a very long, protracted, very low level civil war. That's the best case scenario. In a bad case scenario, the rest of the world can get involved and we can potentially talk about a world war, even a nuclear war. That can, don't underestimate the possibility.
Though, let me
But
come in there.
yeah,
Just over the past day or two, Putin has reassured or has put out a message suggesting that no way should any country even think of going the nuclear war route. But then, of course, these politicians, these high-ranking politicians, speak with a forked tongue. He says the one
yes.
thing, but he could act in a different manner altogether. But if that eventuality does come to pass, what does the scenario look like then?
Well, if it's a nuclear kind of conflict, remember accidents happen during times of war. War started because of accidents. What is currently happening in Taiwan, for example, that is inviting for another accident to happen. With
Absolutely.
Pelosi visiting Taiwan. And accidents happen, you know. If there is a nuclear conflict in Ukraine, then I suspect it will be more a tactical kind of nuclear conflict. What I mean by that is that when we think about the nuclear conflict, we think of Hiroshima kind of bombs. I don't,
Absolutely.
I don't think that is where it's. If a nuclear confrontation is unlikely to include really, really big nuclear weapons. It's most likely to be smaller tactical kind of nuclear weapons, like a nuclear weapon taking out a nuclear power station, for example, or a military base or something similar. And if one of the big powers uses a nuclear, and by the way, the Russians got by far the biggest stockpile of real tactical nuclear weapons. If they decide to use it once, then I'm very sure everybody's going to sit back and say, listen, this is going to escalate into something really bad. Just stop it. We stop it before it really gets really bad. So I don't think the world is heading for a major nuclear confrontation, but it is possible that one or two smaller nuclear devices could be used as a deterrent more than anything else. So that is the benefit of having nuclear weapons. Nobody's going to attack you, and nobody's going to start a war because of nuclear wars, because the consequence of that can be it's just too ghastly to contemplate. But I will not. It's not impossible for relatively small nuclear devices to be used as a deterrent. And in fact, Russia a few months ago actually threatened to use some of these devices.
But he has backtracked. Putin has
Yes,
backtracked on that
indeed.
issue
Yes.
now, but we'll wait and see. But you do know that these guys become absolutely power hungry and they could do the most craziest of things. But be that as it may, there's still lots more issues I do want to cover with you, but let's leave it for next Monday because I only work Monday to Wednesdays. The issue around Zimbabwe's inflation rate sitting at 150%, the issue around gold reserves, how important is gold in economies, why and how do you tie your economy to gold reserves? So a whole lot more that I do want to uncover with you, but let's leave it for Monday. Thank you indeed for a wonderful discussion regarding world currencies, the world economy, the Russian and Ukraine situation, and a whole host more. Thank you, DawieRoodt. Until the next time, as always, God bless.
My pleasure. Thank you.
9:32 news and views right here on Salam Media. We're going to take an ad break and then we will be joined by another deep thinker, and that is David Monyai, Associate Professor of Political Science and International Relations and Director for the Center of Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. We're going to talk yet again about the China-Taiwan tensions this time around. What exactly is the backstory to that? So please stay with us.